Greetings. Welcome to our community Bible study. We come to you from the First Christian Church of Fort Thomas, Kentucky. I'm Larry Smith. I'm the interim pastor of the church. The Book of Ruth is a beautiful short story about a foreign woman who is welcomed into the Israelite community and becomes the ancestress of the most important king in Israelite history. Let's begin our look at the book by recalling the background or the setting of the book. As the writing states in the first verse, these events occurred during the time of the leaders or the judges. A real rough estimate of this time period is between 1200 and 1000 BCE. We can approximate the time of the story itself to around 1125, plus or minus some years. There was no central government. What government there was there came from the tribal and clan leaders and an occasional judge who would be called upon for special actions, usually against some foreign enemy. Crime seems to have been relatively widespread, and unaccompanied women were not safe in public. The population was divided between those who wanted a human king to govern and those who relied on God to keep them safe. Ruth was from the land of Moab, which is located to the west of the Dead Sea. The Moabites were related to the Israelites in the latter's genealogy through Abraham's nephew Lot. Thus, from the Israelite perspective, they were kin, but not all that well respected. They get their name from Moab. Moab was the son of Lot and Lot's oldest daughter. So Moab was the child of incest, and so were his descendants. The two groups were generally on unfriendly terms. However, David, Ruth's great-grandson, appears to have had somewhat better relations with the Moabites, perhaps from his family lineage. In a time of trouble, David sent his parents there for safety. And when Absalom rose in rebellion, he himself fled there. Who wrote this charming book? The book itself does not identify who the author was, although there is a strong tradition that Samuel wrote it. And after all, Samuel did anoint David to be king, and as long as Samuel lived, he seems to have been relatively close to David. But in chapter 4, verse 7, the author needs to explain a customary practice involving a shoe. It seems likely that Samuel himself would not have found it necessary to explain this custom. He was too close in time that might still have been a custom in Samuel's time. More time would seem to have been needed to elapse before the author would have to explain it. Modern scholars tend to date the work during the flowering of Israelite culture about the year 750 or so, the 8th century, or somewhat later as a response to the anti-foreign activities of Ezra and Nehemiah around the year 400 BCE or so. The Hebrew text is somewhat confusing in this regard because it contains some very old Hebrew words that go out of favor, but it also had some much later words that weren't used in the earlier times. So it's kind of difficult from the language itself to make heads or tails out of the dating of this book. What date or which date one chooses is oftentimes connected to the greater or lesser extent to one of the book's themes, and which one you seem to advocate the most. Well, one theme is the defense of foreigners. Ruth was a foreigner in the Israelite tradition. Israelite religion maintained two, at least somewhat mutually exclusive, outlooks on foreigners. And both of these are found in various places in the Tanakh or the Old Testament. Several of the prophets, most especially Jonah, included foreigners in God's orbit, while other prophets, and Ezra and Nehemiah especially, argue against the inclusion of foreigners. When we look at the book itself, Ruth's name is mentioned 12 times. 6 of these times, half of these times, Ruth is identified as a Moabitess. So her foreignness is brought forward and is easily recognized and remembered because it's repeated so many times. But then she's connected with King David. What's the purpose in associating a foreigner with King David? Because this work is elevating the status of foreigners. A second theme of the book is the theme of loyalty. We read about this in Ruth's speech to her former mother-in-law, and that sets the standard for the living out of loyalty from one person to another. You may even hear this speech modified for use in modern wedding services. But Naomi is also loyal. She's loyal to Ruth, and Boaz is loyal to both of them. There was particularly this theme of loyalty in the book of Ruth that is associated with Shabbat or Pentecost, just as Ruth, especially, but also Naomi and Boaz were loyal, so God is also loyal. And then there's the theme of divine reward. This is expressed in Ruth chapter 2. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wing you have come to take refuge. This is spoken by Boaz to Ruth. May you be richly rewarded because you've come under the wing of the God of Israel. You have refuge here. This is Boaz's prayer for Ruth, and it is seen as God's promise to all foreigners who turn to the Lord, to turn to Yahweh. And so the theme of divine reward is found there in the book of Ruth. And all of these are legitimate themes, parts of the book. My conclusion is that the book of Ruth was written by an unknown individual around the year 400 BCE, using either or both written and oral folk traditions. So there was some pre-existing information that was finally written down in this form about the year 400. Others will come to different conclusions, and you can study the book and make your own mind up. The literary nature of this book is fascinating. It's well constructed and beautifully written. No doubt about that. You have a story that is exciting, it's dynamic, there are twists in the plot, but it goes on and it has a happy ending. Yet if you don't recognize the meanings of the names in the story, you will miss a lot. So let me give you some information about what the names in the story actually mean. Well, the title character, Ruth, her name means compassion. Her mother-in-law and then former mother-in-law, Naomi, that name means peaceful. But in the story, there's a great deal of transition and character development, if you will. And Naomi, she has numerous heartbreaks. She suffers famine. She is a refugee. She's an alien in a different country. She suffers the death of her husband and her 2 sons. And when she comes back to Bethlehem, she says, "Don't call me peaceful, call me bitterness, call me Mara." And she goes by that name evidently for a little bit, but later she returns to the name Naomi when things work out much better. Her husband, Elimelech, his name means "my king is God." Exactly how this is to be understood is debated. Is it just sort of a simple statement that God is the king of my life? Or does it go back into the political context of the period of the Judges, where to say, "my king is God," means that you are opposed to earthly kings? But, a lot depends on when the book was written and what the author actually meant by that name. Ruth's husband is called Mahlon, and his name means sickness. So you can read the foreboding here when we learn this guy's name, that he doesn't appear to be long for the world. His brother is named Shilon, and that name means consumption. So likewise, Orpah's husband dies pretty quickly. Who would name their children sickness and consumption? You see some variations in the translations there, but they're not auspicious names. Orpah is disloyal, and that's what her name means. She's disloyal. And Boaz, who marries Ruth and becomes the great-grandfather of King David, Boaz means strength or quickness. It's a really good name. And even the one location that's mentioned by name, Bethlehem, has symbolic meaning in the story. Bethlehem means house of bread. What happened in Bethlehem? There was no bread. So this family has to flee as economic refugees, we'd call them today. People going to get food where the economy is working better. The plot of Ruth is relatively simple. Where bread should be found, there is famine. Where hostility should be found, that is in the land of Moab, there is found compassion, Ruth. God works through all people to achieve God's purposes, in this case, the birth of David. Ruth is a story of faithfulness and commitment, and you see this in her great statement of loyalty in chapter 1, where she says to Naomi, where you go, I'll go. You know, your people will be my people, and where you die, I will die and be buried. She makes this momentous change from her Moabite upbringing and becomes an Israelite. Well, Shavuot or Pentecost or first fruits is connected with harvest, and it ties in with the harvest story here in Ruth, about Ruth gleaning during the barley harvest in mid to late April, which is also the timing for Shavuot or Pentecost. But this celebration recognizes God's gift of the Torah at Mount Sinai. For Jews, the reception of the Torah is a cause for great rejoicing, as it gives them guidance for living as God's people. For Christians, the giving of the Torah has been largely replaced by God's giving of the Holy Spirit. Thus, we have very different emphasis that come out of this time, this festival, for Jews and Christians. For Christians, then, this story is not as important. In Judaism, this is a time of covenant renewal, and there are various ceremonies to accomplish this. So it goes back to the Exodus and the appearance of the Jewish Israelite exiles as they worship there at Mount Sinai and receive the covenant. This is a reliving of that experience. It's a renewal of the covenant. And 15-year-olds in some synagogues reaffirm their own covenant relationship. Their bar mitzvahs for boys or bar mitzvahs for girls. Well, let's look briefly at the outline of the book. There is a narrative development in the book that we can catch with an outline that helps tie the book together. We begin with refugees fleeing from Bethlehem to Moab. They leave Bethlehem because there's no food. They go to Moab, where presumably they find food. And the second part next part is, when they get to Moab, they find food, but they also find death. That's where Abimelech and the two boys both die. But they also found loyalty and compassion when they find Ruth. Then the next portion of the story, Naomi returns to Bethlehem with Ruth, and they have to make a living. They have to find something to do there. Naomi has some kin there, and among the kin is Boaz. So Naomi sends Ruth into the fields to glean or to pick up the leftover wheat and so forth from the harvest. This was a way of helping the poor, helping the needy. It was a form, if you will, of economic redistribution so that poor people would have a living. They would be able to feed themselves. And Ruth is out there working. As she's out there working, Ruth catches the eye of Boaz. As she catches the eye, he begins to give her special treatment and tells his workers to leave a little more grain out there for her to pick up and make sure she's protected from the ruffians and so forth. Then comes the most controversial section in the book. Naomi devises this plot, if you will, to get Boaz to ask Ruth to marry him. So Naomi tells Ruth to go up to the threshing floor. This is where the grain was threshed, barley in this case, and it would be done during the day, and it would be there at night, and you needed someone to guard that. And so Boaz was there guarding the barley, and Naomi tells her to go, and while Boaz is asleep, to creep up next to him and pull a corner of the blanket over her. And Boaz wakes up and wants to know what's going on. And this leads to Boaz's making arrangements so that he could marry Ruth. It was expected of brothers to marry their brothers' widows if there were no children, to have children by their sister-in-law for their brothers. But Boaz doesn't fit that category. So he doesn't have to do this. And anyway, there was a closer relative to Mahlon that had sort of first dibs on Ruth. If he wanted them, he wasn't obligated, and so he declines. He symbolizes this transfer of property. There's some property involved, and responsibilities for Ruth to Boaz by publicly delivering his shoe to Boaz. And they get married, and they live happily ever after, and their offspring leads to King David. I hope that you'll read this book, read it as a whole in one sitting, and you'll enjoy it, I think, tremendously. Thank you. God bless you. See you in our next episode when we'll talk about the book of Lamentations.